The weight of the silence was heavier than the crystal wine glasses she polished. At 18, Lena had learned that in a place like this, all hushed tones and polished mahogany, the most dangerous sounds were the ones that went missing. The clink of a fork stopping midair, the scrape of a chair pushed back, too quickly. The intake of breath that meant a check worth more than her rent was about to be signed, or a world was about to end. Tonight, the silence emanated from table 12. He was an older man, hair more salt than pepper, wearing a tuxedo that was likely tailored in another country. It fit the rigid set of his shoulders perfectly. His face was a mask of strained control, a deep line etched between his brows. He hadn't touched his water, hadn't opened the menu. He just sat, radiating an arctic chill that had the other servers tracing wide, fearful arcs around his table. They called him Herr Vogel. No one used his first name. They didn't need to. His power was a physical presence in the room. "Just leave him," whispered Marco, the head waiter, as she passed the service. "Station. He's waiting for his son. Don't make eye contact." Lena nodded, but her gaze snagged on the man's hand. It rested on the table, knuckles white, a tremor running through his fingers that betrayed the iron composure of his posture. It was the tremor of a man holding back a storm, a man drowning in a sea of his own making. It was a look she recognized. It was the same look her foster father, Mr. Bauman, had worn the day he lost his business, a look of unbearable pressure. She watched for another minute as he shifted, his jaw tight, a low, guttural sigh escaping his lips. The other patrons pretended not to notice. The staff pretended he didn't exist. He was a ghost at his own table, a king in a silent, empty court. Something in her, the part that had been raised on Mr. and Mrs. Bauman's quiet kindness and stubborn dignity, couldn't let it be. She picked up a small, empty, silver pot and a porcelain cup, filled the pot with a chamomile tea they kept warm for special guests, and walked toward table 12. Marco hissed her name. She ignored him. She approached the table, not from the front, but from the side. A gesture of deference she'd learned was crucial. She didn't speak immediately. She simply set the cup down, then the pot. Her movements slow and deliberate. The man's eyes, sharp and cold as obsidian chips, snapped to her. They held a weary anger that could curdle steel. He said nothing. He didn't have to. The unspoken question was an insult. "Who are you to approach me?" Lena met his gaze for a fraction of a second before lowering her own, respectfully, and then she spoke. Her voice was quiet, the casual English gone, replaced by the soft, formal cadence of his native tongue, the proper German she'd absorbed over a decade of shared meals and quiet evenings, with the only family she'd ever truly known. "Der Abend ist kalt, mein Herr," she said. The translated words, "The evening is cold, sir," felt plain in her mind, but she knew the respectful grammar and the formal mein Herr carried the real weight. "Vielleicht würde ein warmer Tee helfen." Perhaps some warm tea would help. The effect was instantaneous. The storm in his eyes didn't just stop. It evaporated. The hard line of his mouth softened. The tension in his shoulders eased by a fraction. It was as if she had spoken a password to a locked room. Inside him, he stared at her, his head tilted, studying her face, her dark skin, her braided hair, as if trying to reconcile her appearance with the sounds she was making. Surprise gave way to a flicker of something else. Curiosity, maybe even a sliver, of gratitude. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. "Dank," he murmured, his own voice, losing its harsh edge. The language a shared secret between them now. She poured the tea. The scent of chamomile and honey filled the small space around them. As she set the pot down, she made the mistake of looking up. That's when she saw him. He was standing just inside the restaurant's main entrance, flanked by two men, in dark suits who seemed like extensions of his own shadow. He was younger than Herr Vogel, but the family resemblance was unmistakable in the sharp angle of his jaw and the intensity of his gaze. But where the father's anger was a hot, contained thing, the son's was a glacier, cold, massive, and capable of crushing anything in its path without a change in temperature. He wore a custom Zegna suit, the charcoal gray fabric looking like sculpted armor. His eyes, however, were what held her captive. They were dark, so dark they seemed to absorb the light in the room, and they were fixed directly on her. He wasn't looking at his father. He was looking at the black waitress who had dared to speak to the old man, who had somehow breached walls he himself had likely spent years navigating. He watched the interaction, his expression unreadable, his stillness more menacing than any overt threat. He moved like the room owed him space. He started walking toward them. The low hum of the restaurant died. Forks froze on their way to mouths. Conversations dwindled into whispers, then silence. This was his son, Lucas, the true power, the man whose name was only ever spoken in fear. He reached the table and the air crackled. He placed a hand on his father's shoulder, a gesture that might have looked affectionate on anyone else. On him, it looked like a claim of ownership. "Father," he said, his voice a low baritone, smooth and cold as river stones. He spoke in English, but his gaze was still on Lena. It felt like an accusation. Before the chairman could respond, the world shattered. The restaurant's ornate, glass doors exploded inward. A concussive blast of sound and shimmering debris. Screams erupted. The chaos bloomed in an instant. Men in black tactical gear poured into the room, assault rifles raised. They weren't police. Their movements were too fluid, too predatory. Lena's training took over. Get down, get cover. But she was frozen for a critical second, staring at the sudden, horrifying violence. That was the moment. Everything changed. Lucas didn't hesitate. He didn't shout or draw a weapon. His movement was a single, economical blur. He shoved his father down behind the heavy oak table, and in the same motion, his arm snaked out, grabbing Lena by the waist. He yanked her back, spinning her behind him so his body was a shield between her and the gunfire that had just started to rip through the room, the air filled with the deafening roar of automatic weapons and the smell of cordite. Plaster dust rained from the ceiling. Crystal chandeliers swayed violently. Lena was pressed against the hard wall of his back, her face buried in the fine wool of his suit. She could feel the coiled tension in his muscles, the absolute calm of his body in a storm of lethal violence. She could smell the persisazan, faint, clean scent of his cologne, something with notes of cedar and smoke. He was a monster, a killer, and he was the only reason she was still alive. Her world had just been reduced to the space he occupied, the shield he provided. The shooting stopped as quickly as it started, replaced by the sound of groaning and the tinkle of falling glass. Lucas didn't move for a long, silent moment. Then he shifted, turning his head slightly. His voice was a low whisper, his breath warm against her ear. "Don't move. Don't make a sound." She could only nod, her body trembling against his. His hand was still firm on her waist, a brand of heat through the thin fabric of her uniform. He held her, and there, as if she belonged to him, a piece on his board he had just decided to protect. The silence that followed the storm was worse than the noise. It was a silence filled with death, and she was trapped in its epicenter with the man who commanded it. The immediate aftermath was a blur of controlled chaos. Lucas's men, the two, shadows from the door, and others who seemed to materialize from nowhere, secured the restaurant with brutal efficiency. They moved through the wreckage, their footsteps silent on the glass-strewn floor. There were bodies rival, attackers neutralized with surgical precision. Lucas never let go of her. He maneuvered her and his father into the relative safety of the kitchen, his hand a permanent fixture at the small of her back. His touch wasn't gentle or reassuring. It was possessive. A statement. "This one is with me." The police wouldn't be called. This was a different kind of justice. In the cold stainless steel kitchen under the flickering fluorescent lights, he finally released her. She stumbled back, hitting a metal prep table. Her legs felt like water. She looked at her hands. They were shaking. "Who are you?" Lucas asked. The question was flat, devoid of emotion. He was studying her again, his eyes missing nothing, the tremor in her hands, the rapid pulse in her throat. "My name is Lena," she managed, her voice thin. "That's not what I asked," he said, stepping closer. He was taller than she'd realized, an intimidating column of dark suit and coiled power. "I asked who you are." Why does a waitress in a place like this speak formal German like she was born to it? His father, Herr Vogel, spoke from a stool where one of Lucas's men was checking him for injuries. "She was being respectful, son. A quality you could learn." His voice was weary, the earlier fire gone, replaced by the tired resignation of a man who lived with violence as a constant companion. Lucas ignored him. His focus was entirely on Lena. "Respect is a currency." "Who taught you how to spend it?" She swallowed, forcing the shaking in her voice to stop. "I was raised by a German family. My foster parents, the Baumans." His eyes narrowed slightly. That was the only sign that her answer had registered. He was processing it, filing it away. She was an anomaly, a puzzle he hadn't accounted for. And Lucas Vogel did not like anomalies. "You are now a witness to an attack on my family," he stated, as if discussing the weather. "That makes you a liability." A cold dread washed over her. She knew what that meant. In his world, liabilities were eliminated. "Or," he continued, his gaze flicking down to her hands, which she quickly clasped together to hide their trembling. "An asset." He looked back at his father, who was watching them with a strange, calculating expression. "He listened to you." "My father doesn't listen to anyone." That was the moment the stakes were raised. She wasn't just a girl who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Her one act of kindness, of cultural fluency, had marked her. It had made her valuable. And in his world, valuable things were owned. He made a decision. It was there in the subtle shift of his weight, the finality in his tone. "You'll come with us." It wasn't a request. She spent the next 3 days in a place she could only describe as a gilded cage. A penthouse apartment overlooking the sprawling lights of the city with floor-to-ceiling windows and furniture that probably cost more than a car. One of Lucas's men, a silent guard named Hans, was posted outside her door at all times. She had everything she needed: food, clothes that appeared in the closet, and books, but she had no phone, no internet, no way to contact the outside world. She was a prisoner. Lucas visited each evening. He would arrive in a fresh suit, looking as immaculate as he had in the restaurant, carrying the chill of the outside world with him. He would sit in an armchair across from her and ask questions about her childhood, about the Baumans, about her life. It wasn't conversation. It was interrogation disguised as courtesy. She learned to be careful, giving him facts but not feelings. Yes, the Baumans were good to her. No, she didn't know much about their family back in the old country. Yes, she was studying at a community college, hoping to transfer. She was building a wall around herself, brick by verbal brick. On the third night, he changed his approach. He didn't ask questions. He brought a beautiful marble chess set and placed it on the low table between them. "Do you play?" he asked. "Mr. Bauwang tried to teach me," she said. "I wasn't very good." "The goal isn't to be good," Lucas said, placing the first white pawn. "It's to understand your opponent's strategy, to see the threats before they form." He looked at her. Play? They played in silence. He was a master, his moves deliberate and far-seeing. She was clumsy, reactive, but she watched him. She saw the way his fingers held, the pieces, the intense focus in his eyes. For the first time, she saw something other than a predator. She saw a mind at work, a brilliant, tactical intelligence. He cornered her pieces, his white army methodically dismantling her black defenses. It was a slow, inevitable slaughter. As he placed the queen that would put her king in checkmate, he spoke without looking up. "The men who attacked us were from the Schneider family. I believe my father is weak. They want to test me." He finally raised his eyes to hers. "They see kindness as a flaw, a vulnerability to be exploited." He paused, and his gaze was unsettlingly direct. My mother was kind. She was gentle. She saw the good in people who had none. My father was powerful. But he couldn't protect her from that. She was killed in a car bombing meant for him. A message from his rivals. They took his queen to check his king, his wound. There it was, not a physical scar, but a chasm inside him. The woman he failed to protect, the reason for the glacial ice in his veins. He equated softness with death. He saw his mother's gentleness in his father's brief moment of peace with Lena, and it terrified him. The danger was escalating. It wasn't just a gang war. It was personal, and now she was in the middle of it. Later that night, she found her chance. Hans, the guard, was called away from his post for a few minutes. A hushed, urgent conversation down the hall. The front door of the penthouse was likely locked, but the service elevator might be an option. She could run, disappear, try to reclaim the simple, ordinary life she'd lost. She stood with her hand on the doorknob, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could leave. She could try to forget the smell of cedar and smoke, the weight of a stare, the story of his lost mother. But as she stood there, she replayed the conversation from the restaurant in her head. The words she'd spoken to Herr Vogel, the way his face had changed. Lucas's men were searching for a leak, a traitor who had told the Schneiders where his father would be that night. And she remembered something. Just before the attack, she had seen one of the restaurant's valets, a man who had worked there for years, speaking on his phone in the alley. He'd looked nervous, shifty. At the time, she'd thought nothing of it. Now, it felt like everything. If she ran, that detail ran with her. Lucas would be blind to a threat inside his own walls. The Schneiders would try again, and they would succeed. She took her hand off the door. It was a deliberate choice, a choice to stay. When Lucas returned an hour later, she was waiting for him, the chessboard still between the chairs. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice steady. He listened without interruption as she described the valet, the hushed phone call, the flash of fear in the man's eyes. He didn't react, his face a perfect mask of neutrality, but she saw a new light in his eyes, a flicker of respect. She hadn't just given him information. She had chosen a side. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city. "You should have run, Lena." "I know," she said, standing as well. "But they'll kill your father, and then they'll kill you." He turned from the window to face her. The space between them felt charged, the air thick with unspoken things. He walked toward her until he was standing, directly in front of her. So close she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Why do you care?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. She didn't have an answer for that, not one she was willing to say out loud. She told herself it was survival instinct. He reached out, his fingers gently brushing a stray braid back from her face. His touch was feather-light, shockingly tender. It was the first time he had touched her without force, without purpose. It was just a touch. Her breath caught in her throat. His gaze dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second, and the temperature in the room seemed to rise. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with the terrifying magnetic pull of two opposite forces. That was the moment she knew she was in more danger than she had ever been. Before, the information about the valet proved to be the key. The man, when found, confessed everything. He worked for the Schneiders, but he wasn't the real traitor. He was just a pawn. The real betrayal came from deeper inside Lucas's organization. His cousin, Kurt, the man who managed his finances, had been selling information to the Schneiders for months. The attack on Herr Vogel was meant to be the final move, a catalyst for a coup that would place Kurt at the head of the family, under the Schneiders' control. The discovery sent a shockwave through Lucas's empire. Betrayal by blood. It was Brader, the deepest wound, the one that festered. Lucas became even colder, more remote. He moved with the deadly quiet of a stalking panther, and the penthouse began to feel less like a cage and more like the eye of a hurricane. He arranged a meeting, a supposed truce, with the Schneider family at a neutral location, a closed art gallery downtown. He told Lena he was taking her with him. Why? She asked, her voice tight with fear. I'm not one of your soldiers. No, he said, his eyes hard. You're my anchor. When my cousin sees you by my side, he will understand that I have lost nothing, that my world is intact. It was a lie. She wasn't an anchor. She was bait. A display of confidence he didn't feel. She knew it. He knew she knew it. The gallery was a cavern of white walls and stark shadows. The air was thick, with tension. The Schneider patriarch, a snake in a silk suit, sat across a large steel table from Lucas. Kurt, the traitorous cousin, stood behind him, his face pale and sweating. Lena sat beside Lucas, her hands clasped in her lap, her back ramrod straight. She focused on her breathing, just as Mrs. Bauman had taught her to do when she was a child plagued by nightmares. Inhale calm, exhale fear. The negotiation was a dance of veiled threats and false promises. Lucas was masterful, his voice never rising, his words precise and cutting. But the Schneiders were confident. They had the advantage. They thought they had broken him. That's when the trap was sprung. The lights cut out, plunging the gallery into absolute darkness. The sound of gunshots exploded from all directions. It was an ambush. Lucas reacted instantly. He pulled her from her chair and under the heavy steel table, his body once again a shield over hers. The sound was deafening. The Birken smell of gunpowder thick in the air. Bullets pinged off the metal above them. In the strobing flashes of muzzle fire, she saw faces contorted in violence, bodies falling. Then came a sound that cut through the chaos. A grunt of pain from above her. Lucas. When the shooting stopped, the silence was punctuated by his harsh, ragged breathing. The emergency lights flickered on, casting a sickly yellow glow over the carnage. Lucas pushed himself up, and she saw the dark stain spreading across the side of his white shirt, just below his ribs. Are you hurt? He gritted out, his eyes already scanning the room for remaining threats. No, she whispered, her gaze fixed on his wound. You are. His men were dealing with the last of the Schneider soldiers. Kurt was cornered, a gun held to his head, but they were exposed. They had to get out. We have to go, she said, her voice finding a sudden strength. She ripped a strip of cloth from the tablecloth on the floor. Here, press this against it. Hard. He took it, his jaw tight with pain. He was vulnerable. For the first time, she saw a crack in his armor. The invincible monster could bleed, and in that moment, she stopped seeing the monster and only saw the man. They made it to the service exit and into the alley. The city sirens were closing in. A lone police car, responding to a call about the gunfire, screeched to a halt at the end of the alley, its lights painting them in strobes of red and blue. Get behind me, Lucas ordered, reaching for the weapon tucked at his back. No, Lena said, stepping in front of him. Her mind was racing. He was a known crime figure, wounded, leaving the scene of a massacre. They would be arrested. He would be finished. She did the only thing she could think of. She walked toward the police car, her hands raised, her face a mask of terrified innocence. She was just a girl, and 18-year-old waitress caught in something terrible. Help, she cried, letting a tremor enter her voice. There was a robbery. They went that way. She pointed frantically in the opposite direction from their escape car, which was waiting silently in the shadows. The officer, a young man with a concerned face, looked from her to the dark alley, his attention diverted. Ma'am, are you okay? Did you see who it was? I don't know. It all happened so fast. Please, you have to catch them. It was just enough. The officer spoke into his radio, relaying her false information. The moment of hesitation gave Lucas and his men the opening they needed. They bundled into their car and were gone before the officer turned back around. Lena simply collapsed into feigned sobs. The perfect victim. She had crossed a line. She had lied to the police, become an accessory, chosen his world over the one she knew. There was no going back. They stitched him up in a safe house, a sterile apartment that smelled of antiseptic. He refused a doctor. Lena, her hands surprisingly steady, cleaned the wound and applied a butterfly bandage as one of his men instructed. He sat on the edge of a bed, stripped to the waist, his perfect suit jacket discarded, on the floor. The dim light traced the lean muscles of his chest and shoulders, the landscape of a body built for violence. There were other scars, faded white, lines that told stories she didn't know. He watched her work, his gaze intense, heavy. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a raw, aching silence. When she was done, she wiped her hands and finally met his eyes. "You should have run," he said again. It sounded different this time, not a statement of fact, but a confession of his own weakness. He had put her in danger. "I know," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. She didn't offer excuses. We didn't try to explain the tangled knot of fear and something else, something fierce and protective that had made her step in front of him. He reached out, his hand cupping her jaw. His thumb stroked her cheek, a gesture of such profound, unexpected tenderness that it stole the air from her lungs. "No one has ever done that for me," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "Stood between me and the fire." She told herself it was survival, that her life was tied to his. But she was lying to herself, and she knew he could see it in her eyes. The Schneiders were not finished. Having lost their inside man and failed in their ambush, they were desperate. They knew Lucas was wounded. They knew he was vulnerable. And they had finally recognized his weakness. It wasn't his father. It was the girl who shouldn't be there, the anomaly who stood by his like. A week later, they came for her. It wasn't a frontal assault. It was quiet, insidious. She was being moved to a new, more secure location. The car was sleek, anonymous, but the driver wasn't one of Lucas's men. She realized it too, late. The familiar route diverged. The car doors locked with a heavy final click. Her blood ran cold. She hadn't been rescued. She had been captured. The war for the city's underworld became a war for one person. Lucas, still recovering from his wound, unleashed the full, terrifying force of his empire. It wasn't about territory anymore. It wasn't about honor or business. It was primal. They had taken something of his. They had taken her. He burned through informants, called in every debt, and tore apart the Schneider operations piece by piece, searching for a single scrap of information about where they were holding her. The city held its breath. The king was hunting. Lena, meanwhile, was not a passive captive. They held her in a warehouse down by the docks, the air thick with the smell of salt and decay. They questioned her, trying to get information on Lucas's plans, his weaknesses. She gave them nothing. She spent her time observing, learning the guards' routines, noting the structural flaws of the old building. She was not a damsel waiting for rescue. She was a survivor, looking for a weapon. Her weapon turned out to be a faulty electrical panel and a bucket of brackish water. During a shift change, when the guards were distracted, she worked quickly. She pried the panel cover open with a piece of scrap metal, and, with her heart pounding, threw the water inside. The effect was immediate. Sparks flew. Lights flickered and died, plunging the warehouse into darkness. Emergency alarms blared, disorienting her captors. It was the chaos she needed, and it was the signal he needed. The assault, when it came, was not a chaotic firefight. It was a symphony of rebellion, destruction. Lucas's men moved through the darkness like ghosts, their suppressed weapons making soft, coughing sounds that were followed by the thud of falling bodies. They were precise, lethal, inevitable. Lucas found her in the center of the chaos she had created. The emergency. Strobes lit the scene in flashes of red. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was dressed for war in black fatigues, his face grim, his movement still stiff from his injury. He dispatched the last guard near her with a cold efficiency that made her shiver. He came to her, his eyes scanning her for injuries. He reached for her, his hands checking her arms, her face, as if confirming she was real. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice raw. "No," she said, her own voice shaking now that the danger was past. He pulled her against him, his arms wrapping around her in a crushing embrace. He buried his face in her hair, and she felt a shudder rack his body. It was not a hug of comfort. It was an act of claiming, of possession, of profound and terrifying relief. He held her for a long moment, the sounds of his men securing, the warehouse fading into the background. One of his most trusted men, Hans, lay dead near the entrance. A cost had been paid. Nothing in their world was free. He finally pulled back, though he kept his hands on her shoulders, holding her in place. He looked at the sparking electrical panel, at the chaos she had wrought. A slow, almost imperceptible change happened in his expression. "My father said you have a gentle heart," he said, his voice low and rough. He looked from the chaos back to her face, his gaze burning with an intensity that seared her to her soul. He was wrong. "You have a steel spine. My enemies will learn to fear you as they fear me." It wasn't a declaration of love. It was something far more dangerous. Acknowledgement. A coronation. He wasn't offering her a place in his life. He was offering her a place on his throne. The final image of that night was not of blood or fear. It was of the ride back to the penthouse, the city lights a river of diamonds below them. She was wrapped in his jacket, the scent of cedar and smoke, a comforting presence. He said nothing, simply kept a hand on her knee, a silent, constant pressure. He was acknowledging what she was to him, no longer deniable, no longer hidden. Later, she stood on the balcony of the penthouse, the cool night air on her skin. The city sprawled before her, a vast, glittering empire of light and shadow. His empire. She heard him come up behind her. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat of his presence, a familiar gravity that had become the center of her new universe. "This was never the life I wanted," she said quietly. "Not to him, but to the city itself." "It doesn't matter what you wanted," he replied, his voice a low murmur next to her ear. "It matters what you chose." She didn't turn. She didn't have to. She had made her choice in that alley, lying to a cop to save him. She had made it again in that warehouse, refusing to be a victim. This world of violence and power was not her birthright, but she had earned her place in it. She looked out at the endless city lights, each one a story, a life, a soul in his kingdom. It was not a fairy tale. It was a throne forged in blood and loyalty. And as she looked out at her new domain, she realized with a chilling certainty she was no longer afraid of it.